3 days after they placed their mother in a nursing home, they found something hidden beneath her bed.
Her children thought they were doing the right thing when they placed her in a nursing home.
When Margaret Wilson's children moved her into a nursing home, they believed they were making the hardest but most responsible decision of their lives. After all, Margaret was 78 years old, living alone, and the house that once carried the laughter of 3 children had become a place filled with silence. Her children told themselves that they were protecting her. They told themselves that the move was necessary, but what they never expected was that the decision they thought was an act of love would eventually lead them to a discovery that would completely change the way they saw their mother. 3 days after Margaret left her family home, her oldest daughter Sarah returned to collect the last of her belongings. She walked through the rooms where she had grown up, touching old photographs and remembering moments she thought she already understood. But when she opened the closet in her mother's bedroom, something caught her attention. Hidden beneath a loose wooden panel under the bed was an old box covered in dust. It was carefully wrapped, almost as if someone had been protecting it from the world. Inside that box were letters, photographs, documents, and memories that Margaret had kept hidden for 30 years. Sarah first believed she had discovered something painful, something her mother had been afraid to reveal. But as she began reading through the documents, she realized she was looking at a story she never knew existed. A story about sacrifice. A story about love. A story that would force 3 children to question whether they had truly known the woman who raised them. Before we go deeper into Margaret Wilson's hidden story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For most of Margaret Wilson's life, she was the person everyone depended on. She was the mother who remembered every birthday, the woman who stayed awake through sickness, the person who always found a way to solve problems even when she had very little left to give. To her children, Margaret was simply their mother, someone who was always there, someone who would always make sacrifices. But children often see only the love they receive. They do not always see the battles their parents fight quietly when nobody is watching. Margaret had spent decades carrying responsibilities that nobody knew about. After losing her husband, Thomas, when her children were still young, she became both mother and provider. She worked long hours as a nurse, came home exhausted, and still found the strength to prepare meals, help with homework, and make sure her children never felt the weight of the struggles around them. Sarah remembered her mother as strong. Michael remembered her as disciplined. Emily remembered her as gentle. But none of them understood how many things Margaret had sacrificed to create the life they enjoyed. As the years passed, her children grew older and started building lives of their own. Sarah moved to another state after starting her career. Michael became focused on his work and responsibilities. Emily remained the closest emotionally, but even she struggled to balance her own challenges with caring for an aging parent. Slowly, the family that once gathered around one dinner table became a family separated by distance, schedules, and responsibilities. Margaret never complained. That was one of the things her children loved about her, but it was also the thing that made them miss the signs. Because Margaret had always been the person who said she was fine, even when she wasn't. Even when the house felt too quiet. Even when she spent holidays sitting alone, looking at photographs of the years when her children were young. She would smile when they called. She would tell them she was doing well. And then, after the phone calls ended, she would return to the silence. As Margaret grew older, her children began noticing changes. She forgot small details. She struggled with some daily tasks. There were moments when she seemed overwhelmed by things that had once been simple. Sarah was the first to suggest that something needed to change. Michael agreed. Emily resisted. She believed their mother still had more independence than they realized. But after several difficult conversations, the 3 siblings reached a decision they never thought they would have to make. They would move Margaret into a nursing home. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves it was for her safety. They told themselves they were doing what any loving family would do. But Margaret's reaction surprised them. She did not argue. She did not fight. She simply looked at her children and said something they would remember for the rest of their lives. "I hope someday you understand why I made the choices I made." At the time, they thought she was talking about the move. They thought she was afraid. They did not realize Margaret was talking about something else entirely, something she had carried silently for 3 decades. After discovering the hidden box, Sarah immediately called her brother and sister. Her voice sounded different. Not afraid, confused. She told them she had found something belonging to their mother, something important. Michael initially believed it was old family paperwork, maybe financial records, maybe documents related to the house. But when Sarah mentioned the photographs, his curiosity changed. "What kind of photographs?" he asked. Sarah paused before answering. "Pictures of someone we don't know." The 3 siblings arranged to meet. They placed the contents of the box on the table and began examining everything their mother had hidden. There were handwritten letters dated decades earlier. There were hospital records. There were photographs of a young child growing up. And there was one name that appeared again and again: Daniel. None of them recognized it. There was no Daniel in their family, no cousin, no family friend, no explanation. For hours, they searched through the documents trying to understand what they were seeing. Then Sarah found a letter written by Margaret, a letter that had never been sent. The first line changed everything. "My dear Daniel, I hope one day you understand why I had to make this choice." The children looked at each other. They realized their mother had spent 30 years hiding an entire chapter of her life. And they had no idea why. The questions came quickly. Who was Daniel? Why had Margaret kept his existence secret? And why did she believe her own children needed to be protected from the truth? The answers would take them back to a time when Margaret was younger, when her children were still growing, and when one decision would change the direction of her entire life. 30 years earlier, Margaret was working at a local hospital. She had always been known as someone who cared deeply for others. Nurses who worked beside her often said Margaret treated every patient like family. One evening, during a difficult shift, Margaret met a young child who had been brought into the hospital alone. The child had no one waiting beside him, no parent holding his hand, no family member asking questions, only fear and uncertainty. Margaret remembered that moment for the rest of her life. Because when everyone else saw a difficult situation, Margaret saw a child who needed someone, and she decided to become that person. What happened next was the secret she carried for 30 years, a secret that would finally explain why Margaret kept that box hidden beneath her bed. And a secret that would show her children a side of their mother they had never truly understood. Margaret Wilson never expected that one ordinary evening at the hospital would become the beginning of a secret she would carry for the rest of her life. She had seen countless people pass through those hospital doors. She had witnessed moments of happiness, moments of heartbreak, and moments when families had to make impossible decisions. But the young child named Daniel was different. There was something about the way he sat quietly, waiting for someone to come back for him, that stayed in Margaret's heart. Daniel was only a few years old when he arrived at the hospital. He had been through more confusion and uncertainty than any child should experience. The circumstances surrounding his situation were complicated, and the people responsible for making decisions about his future were overwhelmed by limited options. While others saw paperwork and procedures, Margaret saw a child who needed stability, kindness, and someone who believed he mattered. Over the following weeks, Margaret became the person Daniel trusted most. She brought him books, helped him feel comfortable, and made sure he never felt invisible. She knew she could not solve every problem in his life, but she believed one person showing up could make a difference. At the same time, Margaret was raising 3 children of her own. Sarah was entering her teenage years, Michael was still discovering who he wanted to become, and Emily was the youngest, still needing her mother's constant attention. Margaret already had a full life, and adding another responsibility seemed impossible. But something inside her refused to walk away. Margaret began the process of becoming Daniel's guardian. She did not do it because she wanted praise. She did not do it because she wanted anyone to know. She did it because she believed that every child deserved a chance. However, Margaret also knew the decision would change everything. She worried about what her own children would think. She worried they would feel replaced. She worried they would believe she had taken love away from them and given it to someone else. Those fears followed her every day. So Margaret made a decision that would eventually become the biggest misunderstanding of her life. She kept Daniel a secret, not because she was ashamed of him, not because she loved him less, but because she was afraid of losing the children she had already spent years protecting. For the next several years, Margaret lived two connected but separate lives. At home, she was the mother Sarah, Michael, and Emily knew. She attended school events. She prepared family dinners. She helped with homework. She celebrated birthdays. She created memories. But away from home, she was also the person guiding Daniel through childhood. She helped him with school. She encouraged his dreams. She supported him during difficult moments. Every month, Margaret found a way to provide for him. And every month, she carried the weight of keeping the truth hidden. The difficult part was that Margaret never saw Daniel as separate from her family. In her heart, she believed she had enough love for everyone. But she knew the world did not always see things that way. She feared judgment. She feared conflict. And most of all, she feared hurting her own children. As years passed, Daniel grew older. He became the kind of person Margaret hoped he would become. Responsible. Kind. Grateful. But even as he built his own life, he never forgot the woman who gave him a chance. He called her Mom. And every time he said that word, Margaret felt both happiness and sadness. Because there was another family she loved who did not know about him. The children she raised had no idea that another person also considered Margaret the most important person in his life. Back in the present day, Sarah, Michael, and Emily struggled to process what they were learning. They had spent their entire lives believing their mother had shared everything with them. Now they were discovering a part of her story that existed before they ever knew the truth. Michael struggled the most. He felt hurt. He wondered why his mother had trusted a stranger with such a significant part of her life, but had never told him. He looked at the letters and photographs and asked a question that many people would ask in the same situation. Why didn't she tell us? Emily looked at him and quietly responded. Maybe she was trying to protect us. But Michael was not convinced. At that moment, they were not only searching for answers about Daniel, they were also confronting their own memories. They began looking back at moments they had forgotten. Times when their mother seemed exhausted but never explained why. Times when she disappeared for hours and simply said she had errands to run. Times when she turned down things for herself because she was always saving money. Suddenly, memories they once ignored started to make sense. The hidden box was not just revealing a secret. It was revealing how little they truly understood about their mother's sacrifices. The siblings decided they needed to find Daniel. They needed to hear the truth from him. Not from old letters. Not from documents. From the person who had been part of Margaret's hidden life for 3 decades. After several days of searching, they found information that led them to Daniel. He was no longer the young child from the photographs. He was now a grown man with a family and a career of his own. When Sarah contacted him, she expected hesitation. She expected anger. She expected confusion. Instead, there was a long silence. Then Daniel asked one question. Is Margaret okay? That question surprised them. Because before asking anything about himself, Daniel wanted to know about their mother. They arranged a meeting, and when Daniel walked into the room, the 3 siblings saw something they never expected. They saw someone who looked at their mother with the same love and respect they had always felt. Daniel did not come with accusations. He did not come demanding answers. He came with gratitude. He told them stories they had never heard. Stories about Margaret working extra shifts so he could participate in school activities. Stories about her encouraging him when he wanted to give up. Stories about how she always reminded him that his past did not define his future. Then Daniel said something that completely changed the way they viewed their mother. "Your mother never hid me because she was embarrassed. She hid me because she was afraid of losing you." The room became silent, because for the first time, Sarah, Michael, and Emily understood the reason behind the secret. Margaret was not choosing between families. She was trying to protect both. But there was still one question remaining. Why had Margaret kept the secret for 30 years? Why had she never finally told them the truth when they were adults? The answer was hidden in one final letter inside the box. A letter Margaret had written years earlier. A letter that was addressed to her children. And when they read those words, they discovered that their mother had been carrying another fear all along. A fear that she would spend the rest of her life misunderstood. The letter sat on the table for several minutes before anyone had the courage to open it. Sarah, Michael, and Emily had already uncovered more about their mother in a few days than they had learned in decades. But this letter felt different. It was not another document. It was not another clue. It was Margaret's own voice, written in her own words, carrying emotions she had never been able to say out loud. Sarah carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's. The same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards, lunch notes, and countless reminders throughout their childhood. But this time, the words were different. This time, Margaret was speaking about the one thing she had spent years trying to protect. Her children's hearts. The letter began with an apology. Not because she regretted helping Daniel. Not because she wished she had made a different choice. But because she was sorry that fear had prevented her from telling the truth. Margaret wrote that she had always wanted her children to know about Daniel. She wanted them to understand that love was never something that became smaller when it was shared. She wanted them to know that bringing another person into her life did not mean she had taken anything away from them. But every time she considered telling them, she imagined the questions. She imagined the confusion. She imagined them wondering why they had not been enough. And that thought broke her heart. Because to Margaret, Sarah, Michael, and Emily had always been enough. They were the reason she worked harder. The reason she kept going during difficult years. The reason she refused to give up when life became overwhelming. She wrote that she did not hide Daniel because she trusted him more than them. She hid Daniel because she loved them more than her own comfort. She knew the secret would eventually hurt. But she hoped they would understand the reason behind it. For the first time since discovering the box, the three siblings began to cry. Not because they were angry, but because they realized something painful. Their mother had spent 30 years carrying a burden that nobody asked her to carry. And while they thought they knew everything about Margaret Wilson, there was an entire chapter of her life they had never taken the time to discover. The revelation changed the way they viewed their childhood. They began remembering moments they had overlooked. They remembered how their mother always seemed to have less money than she should have. They remembered how she worked late nights but never complained. They remembered how she always found a way to help others, even when she was struggling herself. For years, they thought their mother was simply being responsible. Now, they realized she had been making sacrifices they never knew existed. But there was another discovery waiting inside the box. Something that would make them understand just how much Margaret had given. Among the letters were financial records. At first, Michael assumed they were ordinary documents. But as he looked closer, he noticed something surprising. For years, Margaret had been putting money aside. Not for herself, not for retirement, not for a comfortable future. She had been saving money for Daniel's education. She had planned carefully because she wanted him to have opportunities she believed every child deserved. Michael looked at the numbers and became emotional because he knew what those sacrifices meant. His mother had lived simply. She had delayed replacing old furniture. She had worn the same coat for years. She had avoided spending money on herself. And now they understood why. She had been quietly building someone else's future. A future that she never expected anyone to know about. The discovery forced the siblings to ask themselves a difficult question. How much had their mother sacrificed that they never noticed? And perhaps more importantly, how many times had they mistaken her silence for strength without realizing it was also carrying pain? The answer became even clearer when they visited Margaret at the nursing home. Before walking inside, Sarah, Michael, and Emily stood outside the building for several minutes. They were nervous, not because they were afraid of their mother, but because they did not know how to explain everything they had discovered. How do you tell someone you finally understand the love they spent decades trying to show? How do you apologize for something you never realized you needed to apologize for? When Margaret saw them enter the room, she smiled. She did not know about the box. She did not know they had discovered Daniel. She simply looked happy to see her children. That moment made it even harder, because Margaret was not waiting for forgiveness. She was not expecting praise. She was simply grateful that her children had come. Sarah sat beside her mother and held her hand. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Sarah finally said the words she had been carrying. "Mom, we found the box." Margaret became still. For the first time, her children saw an emotion they rarely saw from her. Fear, not fear of being exposed, fear of losing them. Margaret looked down and quietly asked, "How much did you find out?" Emily reached for her mother's hand. "We know about Daniel." The room became quiet. Margaret closed her eyes. For 30 years, she had imagined this moment. She had wondered if her children would understand. She had wondered if they would feel betrayed. She had wondered if the secret she kept to protect them would become the thing that separated them. But then Sarah said something Margaret never expected. "We're not angry because you loved someone else." A tear rolled down Margaret's face. Sarah continued, "We're sad because you carried all of this alone." Those words broke through the wall Margaret had built around herself for decades. Because deep inside, that was the truth she had never admitted. She had been afraid. She had been afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of disappointing her children, afraid that one decision made from love could somehow make them question every moment they shared together. But now her children finally saw the complete picture. They saw a mother who had spent her life giving to them, giving to Daniel, giving to anyone who needed help. And they realized something that many people only understand when it is almost too late. Parents are not just the people who raise us. They are people with dreams, fears, regrets, and stories of their own. They have chapters before us. They have battles they never describe. They have sacrifices we may never discover unless we ask. Over the next several weeks, the family began rebuilding the relationship they thought they had lost. Sarah visited more often. Michael started calling regularly. Emily spent long afternoons with her mother, listening to stories she had never heard before. And Margaret finally experienced something she had secretly wanted for years. Not expensive gifts, not grand gestures. Just time, just presence, just her children being there. But even after the family reunited, there was still one final piece of Margaret's story that they had not uncovered. One final decision she had made years earlier. A decision involving Daniel that would reveal just how far Margaret's love had reached. Because the secret she kept for 30 years was not only about who she helped, it was about the promise she made before anyone knew her name. And when her children discovered that final promise, they realized their mother's greatest act of love had happened long before they ever found the hidden box. For decades, Margaret Wilson believed that some stories were meant to remain quiet. She never wanted recognition. She never wanted anyone to call her a hero. In her mind, she had simply done what she believed was right. But as Sarah, Michael, and Emily began learning more about their mother's past, they discovered that Margaret's secret was not only about Daniel, it was about the promise she had made to herself many years earlier. A promise that no matter how difficult life became, she would never allow a child to feel completely forgotten. After their emotional conversation at the nursing home, Margaret finally opened up about the years she had kept hidden. She explained that when Daniel first entered her life, she never planned for the situation to continue for decades. She thought she would simply help him through a difficult moment. She thought someone else would eventually step in and provide the support he needed. But life does not always follow the plans people make. The more time Margaret spent with Daniel, the more she realized that he needed consistency. He needed someone who would show up, someone who would remind him that his circumstances did not determine his worth. Margaret understood that feeling because she had experienced her own difficult moments. She knew what it felt like to struggle quietly. She knew what it felt like to carry responsibilities without asking anyone for help. And she knew what it meant to have someone believe in you when you were unsure of yourself. That belief became the greatest gift she gave Daniel. Years later, when Daniel became an adult, he often wondered why Margaret never told her children about him. At first, he thought maybe she was protecting him. But Margaret explained something he never forgot. She told him that Sarah, Michael, and Emily were the greatest blessings of her life. She never wanted them to think that their place in her heart had changed. She never wanted them to feel like they had lost something because she had chosen to help another person. Daniel carried those words with him. And when he finally met Margaret's children, he understood exactly what she meant. Because he saw the same love in them that he had experienced from her. They were not strangers. They were people who had been loved by the same woman in different ways. As the family continued talking, Daniel revealed something else that surprised everyone. For years, Margaret had refused every attempt he made to repay her. He had offered financial help. He had offered to make her life easier. But she always refused. She would tell him, "I didn't help you so you could owe me. I helped you because someone needed help." That sentence stayed with him, because Margaret never viewed love as a transaction. She did not keep track of what she gave. She did not expect anything in return. And that was something her children began understanding more deeply. Their mother had spent her entire life giving without keeping score. But the discovery of the box also forced Sarah, Michael, and Emily to confront something uncomfortable. They realized that while Margaret had been protecting them from a difficult conversation, they had also unknowingly created distance. They had become busy. They had assumed their mother would always be there. They had believed that because Margaret was strong, she did not need support. But strength does not mean someone does not need love. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly hope someone notices they are tired. This realization changed the way they treated Margaret. They stopped seeing her only as their aging mother who needed care. They started seeing her as a woman with a lifetime of experiences, a woman with stories, a woman with dreams she had placed aside for others. They began asking questions they should have asked years earlier. What was your first job? What dreams did you have before becoming a mother? What moments in your life made you proud? What moments hurt you the most? And Margaret answered every question. Slowly, the family began discovering the woman behind the role. They learned about the young Margaret who wanted to travel. The woman who loved music. The person who laughed loudly with friends before life became filled with responsibilities. They realized that their mother had been more than the person who packed their lunches and attended their school events. She was a complete person with an entire world inside her. And perhaps the greatest lesson came from something Margaret said during one of their conversations. She told them, "People think parents stop being people when they become parents. But we still have stories, we still have fears, we still make mistakes." Those words stayed with them, because for years they had expected their mother to always know what to do. They had expected her to always be strong. They had forgotten that she was human. As months passed, Margaret became happier. The nursing home that once felt like a place of separation became a place where new memories were created. Her children visited more often. Daniel became part of the family openly. For the first time, there were no more hidden conversations, no more secrets, no more wondering. The box that once represented something hidden became a symbol of something different. It became proof of a lifetime of love. But there was still one final surprise waiting. One final letter Margaret had written before moving into the nursing home. A letter she had placed inside the box but never intended anyone to find until after she was gone. She had written it because she knew there was a possibility that her children might discover the truth someday, and she wanted them to understand one final thing. When Sarah found the letter, she almost did not open it. She felt that reading it was too personal, but Margaret encouraged her. She said, "Maybe it is time you know everything." The letter contained words that would stay with Sarah, Michael, and Emily forever. Margaret wrote that her greatest fear in life was never poverty. It was never loneliness. It was never growing old. Her greatest fear was that the people she loved would remember only her decisions and forget the love behind them. She wrote that every choice she made came from the same place, her heart. She admitted she was not perfect. She admitted she made mistakes. She admitted she should have trusted her children enough to tell them the truth sooner. But she hoped they would understand that every difficult decision came from wanting to protect someone. Then she wrote a sentence that brought everyone to tears. "Love is not measured by how much of yourself you keep. Love is measured by how much of yourself you are willing to give." Those words became the final piece of the puzzle. Because the secret Margaret hid for 30 years was never a secret about betrayal. It was a secret about sacrifice. A secret about a mother who spent her life making room for others. And a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones whose stories we know the least. Years later, when Margaret's family looked back on that moment, they no longer remembered the nursing home as the place where they lost their mother. They remembered it as the place where they finally discovered her. The woman beyond the title of mom. The woman who carried hidden chapters. The woman who changed lives quietly. The woman whose greatest secret was that she had spent 30 years loving people in ways they never knew. And perhaps that is the lesson Margaret Wilson left behind. Before we judge someone's choices, we should ask what they carried. Before we assume we know someone completely, we should remember that every person has stories hidden beneath the surface. Stories of pain, stories of courage, stories of sacrifices that may never be seen. Because sometimes, the biggest discoveries are not about what someone hid from us. They are about what someone did for us when nobody was watching. I hope you loved this story. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Thank you.